On a mild spring afternoon in Meadowvale, the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting warm rays over quiet streets lined with blossoming dogwoods. The day appeared uneventful enough, with neighbors carrying on their routines, some tending to gardens, others strolling with their pets. Little did anyone suspect that on one of these calm avenues, an innocent task would ignite a chain of confrontations few would soon forget. At the center of it all was Dominic Grant, a soft-spoken man in his mid-30s who had just purchased a paired home 2 days prior. He was eager to make the property his own, so the first thing he set out to do was replace all the locks. Standing on the small porch, Dominic methodically swapped out the old hardware, occasionally pausing to check that each component was aligned and secured. Owning real estate in Meadowvale had been a dream of his for years, a goal he'd worked tirelessly to achieve. Finally, the keys to this modest property were in his hands, and he was determined to ensure everything was safe and in proper order. As Dominic worked, he became vaguely aware of a presence nearby. The faint scrape of footsteps and the subtle shift of air around him hinted that he was not alone. At first, he assumed it might be a neighbor going about their day. He had not yet had the opportunity to meet those who lived in the adjacent unit, but he looked forward to forging polite acquaintances, perhaps an occasional nod or friendly wave. However, a quick glance confirmed that this onlooker was not someone curious in a cordial way. Rather, they stood with arms crossed, their posture rigid and watchful. There, a short distance away, stood Lucy Bowden, an individual whose eyes flickered with mistrust. She appeared to be in her early 40s, impeccably dressed for a simple afternoon. By all indications, Lucy was new to the neighborhood as well. The difference, however, was that her face betrayed suspicion rather than open curiosity. She regarded Dominic's changing of the locks with a stern scrutiny, as though carefully evaluating each movement he made. Dominic felt a hint of unease prick at him. It wasn't that he feared confrontation, but the intensity of her stare was unsettling, like a silent accusation he hadn't yet deciphered. Giving a polite nod, he attempted to break the ice. "Afternoon," he said softly, raising a gloved hand in greeting. Lucy did not respond with any warmth, nor did she attempt to mask her disapproval. The moment stretched awkwardly between them, underscoring how quickly an otherwise ordinary task could draw unwanted attention. Unaware that this initial encounter was only the prelude to a much larger dispute, Dominic kept his composure and resumed his work, screws and lock cylinders at the ready. He had no idea that in mere moments, Lucy Bowden would confront him with a flurry of accusations. Accusations that would transform a simple day of home maintenance into an explosive controversy, laying bare the tension simmering behind Meadowvale's manicured exteriors. From the moment Lucy Bowden locked eyes with Dominic Grant, tension sparked in the air. Dominic, still crouched by the door, sensed an undercurrent of hostility he couldn't quite place. He pressed a final screw into the new lock, aware that Lucy's gaze had intensified. Without a word of greeting, she strode toward him, her expression cold and critical, like a judge about to issue a verdict. "Excuse me," Lucy said sharply, halting a few steps away. Her voice carried a clipped precision that contrasted starkly with the serene afternoon. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Dominic, startled by her abruptness, stood upright and turned to face her directly. "I'm changing the locks," he said simply. He gestured to the tools in his hand. "I just purchased this unit a couple of days ago. The old locks needed an upgrade." Lucy's eyes flickered with doubt. "Purchased, you say?" Her tone was loaded with skepticism. "That's interesting, because I'm not aware of any new owners around here, certainly not in this unit. Are you sure you're not on the wrong property?" Dominic maintained a measured calm, though he felt a surge of irritation at her challenging words. "I'm certain. I have the paperwork, the keys, everything. This is now my place." A faint smirk curled at the corner of Lucy's lips. "Well, you see," she began, attempting an air of knowledgeable superiority, "I've lived in Meadowvale for a while, and I'm quite familiar with the community council. If someone had bought this paired home, we would have heard about it, especially if they planned on making changes." She cast a meaningful glance at the lock set Dominic was installing. He inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. I'm not sure how the council shares information, but the deed is in my name. I can show you the documentation if you'd like. He took a step toward his toolbox, intending to retrieve the folder containing proof of ownership. But Lucy's demeanor only grew more suspicious. I don't see why you'd have any right to do this unless you're a guest or a contractor with official permission. That's typically how it works in this neighborhood. One doesn't just wander onto someone's porch and start removing locks. A few curious neighbors who had stepped outside for fresh air now lingered within earshot, sensing the charged atmosphere. Dominic noticed them exchanging quiet glances as they surveyed the scene, some eyebrows arched in recognition that Lucy was on the offensive, while others displayed concern for the stranger under scrutiny. For his part, Dominic was keenly aware of how this conflict might escalate if he didn't keep his head. Listen, he said, striving for a calm reassurance. I'm a legitimate resident. I'm not trespassing or vandalizing anything. If you want to see proof, I'm happy to show you the transaction records. Lucy folded her arms, unwavering. I'll need more than your word, she stated, her voice dripping with insinuation. And with that, she lifted her smartphone, thumbs already tapping in preparation for the next step in her campaign of doubt. In that moment, Dominic realized that his day of routine home maintenance was quickly spiraling into a confrontation. Lucy's unwavering hostility, combined with her hasty move to escalate matters, spelled out trouble ahead, trouble that no stack of documents, it seemed, could easily deter. Even before Lucy Bowden had finished dialing, Dominic Grant knew what would come next. The determined set of her shoulders and the tight press of her lips made it clear that she was ready to formalize her accusations. Quietly, he set aside his tools, bracing himself for a conversation that threatened to shift from neighborly disagreement to legal confrontation. Standing by the door he'd been working on, Dominic overheard fragments of Lucy's call, words like trespassing, suspicious, and attempting a break-in drifted across the short distance between them. A hollow feeling spread in his chest as he realized how swiftly a routine task had been cast in a criminal light. The neighbors who had been idly watching now listened intently, their postures tensing as Lucy enumerated her grievances to whoever was on the line. Once her call ended, Lucy turned to Dominic with a triumphant gleam in her eye. Security is on the way, she announced crisply, as though expecting him to flee the scene. I recommend you stay right there until they arrive, so we can clear this up. Dominic, though rattled by her audacity, kept his composure. I'm not going anywhere, he replied evenly. But I'll remind you again, I'm well within my rights to change these locks. I bought this paired home 2 days ago. Lucy narrowed her eyes, her skepticism unrelenting. Yes, you keep saying that. Funny how I've lived in Meadowvale for quite some time, and no one ever mentioned a sale going through here. And I attend all the community council meetings. Her words hung in the air, brimming with the implication that if Lucy didn't know about it, it couldn't be valid. The quiet watchers exchanged glances, some murmuring among themselves about the unfolding scenario. Dominic noticed that a few seemed unsettled by Lucy's aggressive approach, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Moments stretched into tense minutes. The rhythmic tap of Lucy's foot on the porch floor underscored her impatience, while Dominic silently recounted the hours he'd spent finalizing paperwork at the real estate office. The difference in their perspectives was stark. For Dominic, the purchase was a life-changing step toward stability and growth. For Lucy, it was an unwelcome disruption to her carefully curated environment. Eventually, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness. A patrol car, presumably from the local security service or possibly the city police, pulled up to the curb. A pair of officers emerged, scanning the scene. Lucy waved them over, launching into an impassioned account of how she'd caught a man trying to force his way into a residence. Dominic, though outwardly calm, felt his pulse quicken. He had full confidence in the legitimacy of his purchase, but the gravity of a police presence was undeniable. He took a moment to steady his breathing, then stepped forward to meet the officers. With Lucy's accusations freshly in their ears, the officers nodded for him to speak. In a clear, calm voice, Dominic began his explanation, hoping that reason and documentation would prevail over speculation and fear. The atmosphere outside the paired home was charged, a silent anticipation hanging in the late afternoon air. As Dominic Grant took a measured step forward, the two officers, one wearing a city patrol uniform and the other possibly from the neighborhood's private security firm, watched him intently. Their solemn faces betrayed no sign of immediate bias, and that alone gave Dominic a small glimmer of hope. Lucy Bowden, however, seemed invigorated by the officer's arrival. She immediately launched into her version of events, eager to shape their perception. "Officers, I'm telling you, this man is forcing his way into a property that doesn't belong to him," she declared, her voice trembling with urgency. "He claims he owns it, but I attend all the meetings of the community council, and no sale has been reported. I've never seen him around here before." Her fervent tone painted Dominic as a cunning trespasser, even though she had no actual evidence to back it up. Dominic kept silent, letting her finish. The lead officer, identified by the name tag Wilson, raised a hand in a polite gesture to calm Lucy. Turning to Dominic, Officer Wilson asked, "Sir, can you explain what's happening here?" Dominic retrieved a small folder from his tool bag. "My name is Dominic Grant, and I purchased this paired home 2 days ago. I've got all the relevant paperwork here, including the signed deed and the closing documents from the real estate office." He stepped forward slowly, extending the folder so that Officer Wilson could examine it. "I was just changing the locks to secure the property." While Officer Wilson leafed through the papers, the second officer quietly observed the surroundings. Dominic surmised that they were verifying the condition of the front door, looking for any signs of forced entry. Finding none, the officer nodded slightly, a wordless confirmation that things seemed in order. Lucy, standing a few steps away, folded her arms tightly. Despite the unfolding evidence, she appeared poised for rebuttal, her expression set in grim defiance. "I still don't see how we wouldn't have known about a sale," she muttered under her breath. Officer Wilson lifted his gaze from the documents. "These records look legitimate. Mr. Grant's name is on the title, and the transaction date is very recent. It appears that he does, in fact, own this property." The finality in his tone was clear, there was no sign of wrongdoing in Dominic's actions. A silent wave of relief coursed through Dominic. Though he'd been confident in his legal right, the presence of law enforcement always introduced an element of unpredictability. He watched Lucy's reaction closely, curious if she would accept this resolution with dignity. To his surprise, her cheeks colored with a mixture of embarrassment and residual hostility. The tension that had crackled in the air now morphed into a resentful hush. Stepping forward, the second officer addressed Lucy directly, "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern for neighborhood safety, but it's important to verify the facts. Mr. Grant's ownership is valid." For a moment, Lucy appeared to waver, caught between the blow to her pride and a desire to maintain the moral high ground. She cast a quick glance at the cluster of neighbors who had gathered to witness the spectacle. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to mild reproach, reminding her that this was not a private confrontation. A cough broke the silence as one of the neighbors cleared his throat. "Guess that settles it then," he said quietly, a thin smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Others murmured in agreement, and the group seemed ready to disperse now that the tension had eased. However, Lucy had one last card to play. Squaring her shoulders, she fired a final salvo at Dominic. "This doesn't change the fact that you should have informed the community council about your purchase," she stated, her voice tinged with rancor. "There are rules in place to maintain harmony here." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "I plan to follow all the community guidelines. But it's not mandatory to announce a sale to the entire neighborhood. The formal notice will come from the real estate office and the city's records." His voice remained calm, yet a trace of weariness crept in. Dealing with Lucy felt like wrestling with shifting sands. No matter how clear his evidence was, she found a new angle to contest. The officers, sensing the dispute had run its course, returned Dominic's paperwork. Officer Wilson offered a courteous nod. "Everything checks out. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Grant. And Ms. Bowden, we appreciate your vigilance, but it might help to confirm details before calling the authorities next time." With those parting words, they bid the group goodbye, leaving behind an odd stillness in their wake. In that lingering hush, Lucy stood speechless for a moment, her posture rigid as she grappled with the loss of face. Dominic, for his part, found little satisfaction in her discomfort. All he wanted was to secure his property and move forward peacefully. Yet the events of the day hinted that Lucy's hostility might not end here. Sure enough, as she stormed off with anger radiating from every step, Dominic recognized that the real challenge might be just beginning. Ownership of the home he'd just worked so hard to purchase was now overshadowed by the looming presence of a neighbor who seemed intent on casting him as a trespasser in his own space. Peace did not linger long after the police departed. Though Lucy Bowden had been forced to accept Dominic Grant's right to occupy the paired home, the residual sting of her public humiliation seemed to intensify her resentment. Over the next few days, a series of petty actions, both sly and overt, revealed that Lucy was not ready to concede defeat. Dominic first suspected trouble when he found a small, crudely written note affixed beneath the windshield wiper of his car. It was early morning, and a chill lingered in the crisp spring air as he made his way to run errands. The note, scrawled in hurried handwriting, read, "Watch your step, you won't last here." Though unsigned, Dominic had little doubt about its origin. The message was short but unmistakably threatening, oozing a quiet malice that left him momentarily taken aback. He stood for a moment on the curb, the sun just peeking over the rooftops, and debated his next move. Having spent part of his career in situations that demanded he remain clear-headed under stress, Dominic forced himself to remain calm. He photographed the note, then carefully removed it and placed it in a folder for safekeeping. He would not respond in kind or escalate the situation. Instead, he decided to document everything. If Lucy planned to turn this into a drawn-out confrontation, he would meet it with methodical caution and a paper trail. It soon became apparent that Lucy's aggression extended beyond anonymous notes. Dominic discovered he had been reported for a series of infractions to the community council. The accusations were, at best, trivial: noisy renovations at odd hours, he had installed a new ceiling fan midday, improper disposal of packaging materials, he'd left cardboard boxes in the recycling bin, and, most perplexing of all, a complaint about the color of his drapes not being in line with neighborhood aesthetics. Each claim lacked substance, but they arrived in swift succession, demanding Dominic's time and energy to address. As the complaints piled up, Dominic maintained his patient approach. He fired off polite email responses to the community council with receipts, photographs, and timestamps proving the legitimacy of his actions. For instance, the cardboard boxes had been neatly broken down and placed out for collection at the designated time. The color of his drapes was neutral, and no official rule existed about uniform curtain hues. The more Lucy pushed, the more Dominic recognized that her true aim was to unnerve him into either leaving or retaliating. Nevertheless, the stress of constantly defending himself took a toll. Dominic yearned for the peaceful life he had envisioned upon purchasing the paired home. Instead, he found himself embroiled in an ongoing battle of wills with a neighbor who refused to acknowledge any boundary. On some evenings, as he double-checked that his doors were locked and the yard was clear, he couldn't help but wonder if the property was worth this mounting trouble. His uncertainty crystallized into a quiet resolve the day he discovered a second note, this time tucked beneath his doormat. It read, "You don't belong here. Leave now." The words felt heavier than before, a stark sign that Lucy's hostility was far from cooling. Rather than succumb to a sense of dread, Dominic steadied himself for the next phase of their conflict. Believing that official channels might be his best recourse, Dominic gathered every complaint, photograph, and note into a growing dossier of evidence. He also began consulting with a friend who happened to be a lawyer, seeking advice on how best to proceed. Defamation or harassment claims were options, but Dominic hoped to avoid legal entanglements if a simpler resolution was possible. Still, he recognized that Lucy's actions were not mere annoyances, they bordered on harassment. During that time, neighbors started to pick up on the rift between Dominic and Lucy. Whispers circulated about the threatening notes, the repeated complaints, and the uneasy undercurrent that now shaded life on their otherwise peaceful street. Some neighbors offered Dominic quiet support, exchanging sympathetic smiles when they spotted him returning from the hardware store or stepping out to check the mail. Others avoided involvement, wary of igniting Lucy's ire. In the midst of these uneasy interactions, Dominic reminded himself of why he'd chosen to settle in Meadowvale, the prospect of a stable home and a sense of belonging. Although Lucy's campaign of pettiness tested his patience, he refused to yield to intimidation. Every time he found a new complaint or discovered yet another unsolicited note, he added it to his meticulously kept records. What Lucy might not have realized was that her relentless needling only hardened Dominic's resolve. While her attempts to isolate and distress him were wearing, they also underscored the importance of standing firm in the face of bullying. And so, as he locked up his files each night, Dominic prepared for whatever fresh obstacle might await him in the morning, confident that, with patience and diligence, he could outmaneuver any plot aimed at driving him away from the home he had rightfully claimed. Over the following weeks, the tension between Dominic Grant and Lucy Bowden in the Meadowvale community reached new heights. Each day brought another round of petty conflicts, tapped brakes, scowls across the street, or additional complaints logged with the community council. Dominic, growing increasingly weary, found himself forced to devote more time to warding off Lucy's relentless attempts to undermine his position. He refused to give in, though. Instead, Dominic decided to fortify both his property and his legal standing. With the help of a local security firm, he installed a series of discreet cameras around the perimeter of his paired home. High-resolution lenses pointed at the front yard, the driveway, and the porch, areas Lucy seemed fond of targeting with her notes and unannounced visits. Now, anything that happened would be recorded, providing Dominic with a sense of both security and evidence. The cameras had an immediate, if unsettling, effect. Lucy's intimidation tactics did not cease, but they became more cautious. She seemed to realize she was being watched, causing her to adapt by reporting even more inconsequential infractions to the community council. One day, Dominic received a formal notice accusing him of inappropriate renovation sounds, though the letter gave no specifics, only that neighbors had heard hammering outside permissible hours. Another complaint targeted the color of his newly painted front door, claiming it clashed with the traditional aesthetic of Meadowvale. In each instance, Dominic documented the reality: quiet hours respected, color choices nowhere close to contravening any official guidelines, and responded with methodical precision. Suspecting that Lucy's campaign was not merely a series of personal vendettas but a broader attempt to drive him out, Dominic consulted a lawyer recommended by a trusted friend. In a small, book-filled office on the outskirts of the city, he described every incident in painstaking detail, every note, every baseless complaint, every pointed remark. The attorney, an experienced litigator named Stacy Howell, listened intently. She frowned whenever Dominic recounted an especially audacious instance of Lucy's harassment. "You've got a decent harassment case on your hands," Stacy eventually remarked, tapping a pen against her notepad. "She's making your life difficult for no legitimate reason, and you have evidence. If you want to press charges or file a restraining order, you could. But sometimes just letting the other side know you're prepared to act is enough to make them back off." Dominic considered her words, torn between the desire to stand his ground and the wish to avoid a protracted legal battle. "I prefer to keep this from escalating into a court case," he admitted. "But if Lucy continues with these tactics, I need to protect myself." Stacy nodded, handing him a neatly compiled set of documents. "Then document everything, and let the community council know you've sought legal counsel. It might deter her from pushing further." Armed with that advice, Dominic returned home with renewed resolve. In the following days, each new complaint Lucy lodged was met with a politely worded rebuttal, attached with photographic or video evidence. He also forwarded copies to Stacy, ensuring a backup of all records. By the third or fourth round of such correspondences, Dominic noticed a subtle change in the tone of the notices from the community council. They no longer carried the same implicit acceptance of Lucy's claims. Instead, the language became more neutral, reminding Lucy that all allegations must be supported by proof. Despite the minor shift in official stance, Lucy continued her crusade, seemingly unwilling to concede. She left cryptic messages on community bulletin boards questioning Dominic's character, insinuated that his renovations were dangerously amateur, and even spread rumors that he had purchased the paired home through dubious means. Each rumor was swiftly debunked by Dominic's records or by neighbors who had grown tired of her baseless stories. Exasperated, yet spurred on by the principle of defending his own space, Dominic persevered. The cameras captured Lucy occasionally lurking near his property, glaring at the security devices, perhaps realizing that her every move was being recorded. Whenever she spied him returning from the hardware store or carrying a new piece of furniture, she would huff dramatically as though personally affronted by his improvements. Meanwhile, a contingent of sympathetic neighbors quietly expressed their support for Dominic. Some offered kind words, others dropped off small gifts, cookies or welcoming notes, that reminded him not everyone in Meadowvale shared Lucy's combative spirit. On his part, Dominic made an effort to show gratitude, occasionally inviting these well-intentioned neighbors over for a brief chat, forging connections that Lucy's hostility had initially driven him to forego. All the while, Lucy's complaint file at the community council grew thicker, but so did Dominic's meticulously compiled evidence. Each notice was as carefully answered as the last. Each rumor was politely countered by actual paperwork. Through it all, Dominic remained calm, assured by the knowledge that truth was on his side. The path Lucy had chosen, an endless barrage of pettiness, was bound to trip her up sooner or later, especially in the face of unwavering documentation and a cautious readiness to involve legal measures if pushed too far. Standing in his living room one night, flipping through the images captured by the security cameras, Dominic let out a slow breath. The flicker of Lucy's figure, disappearing around the corner of his fence, stirred no fear, only resolve. He was more certain than ever that in the long run, she would fail to dislodge him from the home he had rightfully bought. And if Lucy's endgame was to intimidate him into leaving, she was about to learn a hard lesson: intimidation only works on those who surrender to it. As weeks stretched into months, the confrontation between Dominic Grant and Lucy Bowden evolved into a fixture of Meadowvale gossip. One by one, neighbors found themselves drawn into the fray, forced to choose sides or at least form private opinions. Some residents, who valued a harmonious community and recognized Dominic's calm perseverance, offered him quiet support. Others, however, aligned with Lucy's perspective, convinced that any homeowner so recently arrived must adhere strictly to unwritten rules and long-standing norms. The escalation reached a flashpoint when the community council scheduled a public forum to address the growing number of complaints flooding their office. Though the council typically handled property matters and neighborly disputes behind closed doors, Lucy's ceaseless grievances, combined with Dominic's meticulous counterarguments, had made the issue impossible to ignore. Flyers were posted in the local cafe and on street lamp bulletin boards, announcing an open meeting for all interested residents. On the evening of the meeting, the Meadowvale Community Center was unexpectedly abuzz. Residents arrived in clusters, some out of curiosity, others seeking to shape the council's decisions. Dominic took a seat near the front, a folder of evidence resting on his lap, photographs, documents, even printouts of the questionable notes Lucy had left. He had no desire to publicly embarrass her, but he was ready to defend himself should she continue her baseless attacks. Lucy, for her part, walked in with her head high, flanked by two acquaintances who evidently shared her viewpoint. She clutched a sheaf of papers in one hand, presumably the latest litany of allegations against Dominic. When their eyes met across the crowd, her expression hardened, but Dominic merely inclined his head in polite acknowledgement. The tension in the room was palpable, as though the entire community was bracing for the clash of their competing narratives. When the council chair, a middle-aged woman named Deirdre Stein, called the meeting to order, she began by outlining the reasons for this rare open forum. "We've received numerous complaints regarding changes and conflicts in the neighborhood," she said, her tone measured. "This meeting is an opportunity for all involved parties to voice concerns and provide evidence." Lucy was the first to approach the lectern. Clearing her throat, she unleashed a torrent of accusations. Dominic's renovations were out of sync with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, his activities were allegedly causing noise at all hours, and she expressed fear that his repeated modifications signaled something unsettling about his presence in Meadowvale. While she spoke, she brandished photos of Dominic's new fence, the repainted front steps. Any small change she could interpret as a violation. The expression on the faces of those assembled was mixed. Some nodded in sympathy, trusting Lucy's portrayal of a neighbor turning the block upside down. Others, however, appeared skeptical, glancing sideways at Dominic with a question in their eyes. Could this quiet, polite man really be the disruptive force Lucy insisted he was? Then came Dominic's turn. Rising with composure, he took the lectern and calmly presented the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. He showed timestamps from his security cameras, revealing that his home improvements occurred within reasonable hours. He displayed his official permit for the fence addition, complete with the Meadowvale municipality's stamp of approval. Most tellingly, he revealed messages from the community council that refuted Lucy's allegations, small disclaimers that her complaints had lacked adequate proof, annotated with official council responses indicating no violations were found. A hush fell over the crowd as Dominic laid out his narrative. His tone was neither defensive nor confrontational. Instead, he simply highlighted the discrepancy between Lucy's claims and the documented reality. "I respect everyone's right to be concerned about maintaining standards," he said, looking directly at the council members, "but accusations must be substantiated. I've tried to handle this quietly, responding to each complaint with proof that I'm following the rules. Yet, the complaints continue." At that, he flashed the notes Lucy had left. Threatening was the word he used, though he refrained from any personal attacks. The audience stirred as the scrawled words came into view on the overhead projector. Lucy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks coloring. The weight of public scrutiny pressed in. No longer could she rely on behind-the-scenes rumor-mongering, the harsh glare of collective judgment fell upon her actions. When he finished, the room erupted in murmured discussion. Some people expressed dismay that Lucy's concerns had taken on such a hostile tone, while others recognized in Dominic's thorough presentation a reasoned approach deserving of respect. Councilwoman Stein quietly conferred with her colleagues, then addressed the assembly. "We must be careful," she said, "to balance community standards with the rights of every homeowner. Based on Mr. Grant's evidence, we see no violations of council regulations. We encourage Ms. Bowden to exercise more caution before filing further complaints." Lucy, sensing the shift in sentiment, stood up abruptly. "You're all blind if you can't see the real problem here," she spat, her frustration evident. Without waiting for a response, she stormed out of the hall, leaving behind a collective sense of relief and awkwardness. The tension dissipated in her wake, replaced by a cautious optimism that the feud might be nearing its end. Dominic, exhaling softly, gathered his papers. Neighbors he'd only seen in passing now approached to shake his hand or offer a few kind words. Though the conflict was not formally over, the public condemnation of Lucy's relentless complaints signaled a turning point. For the first time since he'd purchased the paired home, Dominic felt he might finally find the peace and sense of community he sought in Meadowvale, despite Lucy Bowden's best efforts to prove otherwise. In the weeks after the community forum, Meadowvale seemed to draw a collective breath of relief. The hostility that once crackled in the air had softened, particularly around Dominic Grant's residence. Having publicly presented his evidence, and effectively countered Lucy Bowden's torrent of baseless complaints, Dominic found neighbors more willing to greet him with friendly nods and casual waves. Some even made a point of introducing themselves, a clear departure from the tense standoff that had defined his first days in the neighborhood. The community council, too, took steps to affirm the conclusions reached at the meeting. In a brief email to all residents, they reiterated that no further action was required from Dominic and gently reminded everyone that substantial proof was necessary before lodging any formal complaints. The message wasn't overtly directed at Lucy, but its implication was clear: the council had grown weary of frivolous allegations that stirred discord without evidence. Lucy, for her part, maintained a low profile in the aftermath. Though she had stormed out of the forum in a fury, she no longer paraded her grievances through public channels. A few neighbors reported seeing her lurking behind hedges or watching from her windows whenever Dominic was outside, but her capacity to disrupt had waned significantly. Still, Dominic wasn't convinced that this newfound calm was permanent. Her unpredictable temper loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. As for Dominic, he finally had the space to breathe. His improvements to the paired home proceeded smoothly: fresh coats of paint, newly installed fixtures, and landscaping that turned the modest property into a warm and welcoming space. In place of anxious glances at the street or the camera footage, Dominic now found himself focusing on day-to-day tasks and forging tentative friendships. He even organized a small housewarming barbecue one weekend, where a half-dozen neighbors appeared, curious to see if the rumors of his supposed troublemaking held any truth. They left convinced otherwise, impressed by his considerate hospitality and practical approach to living in Meadowvale. Yet amid the mended fences and newly built bridges, Dominic remained watchful. The events of the past few months reminded him that prejudice and aggression could lurk behind polished facades. Each evening, as he locked up, he cast a final glance at the security camera feeds, verifying that all was calm. Sometimes, he'd spot Lucy's silhouette at a window across the way, prompting a quiet sigh of resignation, an acknowledgement that, while outward hostilities might have cooled, the undercurrent of tension hadn't vanished entirely. Still, for the time being, life in Meadowvale entered a gentler phase. With Lucy subdued by public disapproval and Dominic's documented diligence, the neighborhood breathed easier, enjoying the peace that followed a well-handled confrontation. Perhaps it was only an interlude, a lull in what might yet be a bigger storm. But Dominic chose to embrace it, mindful that every moment of peace was valuable in a community still learning to see beyond surface judgments and petty power plays. Tranquility, however, has a way of being fleeting. As Dominic Grant moved on with his life, taking pride in the modest but comfortable paired home he had worked so hard to secure, an uneasy stir began to form in the undercurrents of Meadowvale chatter. Whispers suggested that Lucy Bowden was not done yet, that her silence was merely the pause before a renewed onslaught. While many hoped her resentment had dissipated, there were still signs that Lucy nursed a grudge beneath her outward compliance. The first inkling came when Dominic started noticing small changes around Lucy's side of the property. Occasionally, he'd glimpse her on the porch, phone in hand, taking photos or videos of the simplest things: a new garden gnome, a wind chime, a freshly swept path. She never directly confronted him, but her silent filming sessions left him unsettled. He documented these instances, quietly adding them to the ever-growing archive of potential evidence. A second omen emerged when the community council forwarded Dominic another complaint. This one more vague than ever: excessive personal modifications to the shared structure. The claim cited no specific rule or documented change. Dominic responded with his usual thoroughness, referencing the guidelines he'd already adhered to. The council, for its part, acknowledged his compliance, advising him that the complaint lacked substance. But the repeated annoyance was draining, a reminder that Lucy's presence loomed just beyond a thin veneer of civility. Amid these warnings, Dominic refused to yield. He continued improving his property with the same caution and diligence, thoroughly documenting each step to guard against any sudden escalation. Meanwhile, sympathetic neighbors occasionally dropped hints that Lucy had been complaining privately, insisting Dominic's influence was destabilizing the community. Such grumblings never went official, but they reaffirmed Lucy's unyielding displeasure. Even so, the bulk of Meadowvale's residents seemed content to let the matter rest. Most welcomed Dominic's calm presence, and a few went out of their way to signal their support, some by small gestures of kindness, others by exchanging a friendly wave as they passed by. After all, for every rumor Lucy whispered, Dominic had transparent, verifiable actions to negate it. Over time, it became clear who was causing trouble and who was merely trying to live peacefully. Perhaps Lucy felt cornered by the growing communal acceptance of Dominic's rightful place in Meadowvale. Perhaps she believed that biding her time might yield a more opportune moment to strike. Whatever her reasoning, the uneasy equilibrium continued, each day passing without the dramatic confrontations that once colored the neighborhood's atmosphere. In the stillness of that waiting game, Dominic remained vigilant. He had learned early on that quiet resentments can transform into full-blown conflict with little warning. Though cautious, he refused to let fear dictate his movements. The next chapter of his experience in Meadowvale, he suspected, was closer than ever, a chapter that would test the patience and resilience he'd cultivated throughout this ordeal. Months later, Dominic Grant believed he had finally reached a state of lasting calm. He had begun to enjoy his life in Meadowvale without the continuous burden of defending his home from Lucy Bowden's antics. Though their sporadic tensions never entirely vanished, the neighborhood had mostly settled into a new normal. Dominic's neighbors waved in greeting each morning, the community council had no fresh complaints on record, and Lucy's presence was muted, an occasional glimpse through her curtains, nothing more. Then came the day that rumors began to swirl. Whispers around the block indicated Lucy was leaving, forced out by financial troubles or personal discontent. No one knew the exact details. Regardless, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the area. Dominic, relieved yet cautious, decided to remain impartial. He had no desire to gloat over someone else's misfortune, he simply hoped this signaled the end of their rivalry. Indeed, Lucy soon packed up her belongings and departed. For a short period, Meadowvale felt lighter, as though a persistent shadow had lifted. Neighbors approached Dominic with visible relief, congratulating him on the quiet that followed. And while Dominic, too, felt unburdened by her departure, a small voice inside reminded him that Lucy's tenacity was not to be underestimated. That intuition proved correct. Barely weeks after Lucy's exit, Dominic learned of an astonishing development. Lucy had purchased a property across the street. The news spread rapidly, fanning fresh waves of speculation. Some insisted she was back to finish what she started, while others chalked it up to a simple coincidence. Yet, given her history, few believed in coincidence. When Dominic caught sight of her unloading boxes at the new address, their eyes met, his calm, hers defiant. The faint smirk on her face suggested that Lucy felt she had found a new angle, a fresh vantage point from which to resume their standoff. If she believed he would be intimidated, however, she was mistaken. In the time since their last confrontation, Dominic's resolve had grown stronger. His files remained carefully organized, security systems updated, and alliances within the neighborhood were more supportive than ever. A neighbor, noticing his surprise, gently remarked, "Well, I guess we're in for round 2. Dominic managed a quiet laugh, acknowledging the truth behind the observation. He recognized that Lucy's determination to control the narrative might lead to another flurry of accusations and mischief. But this time, he was prepared legally, socially, and emotionally. When Lucy sent him a thinly veiled message, a note praising new beginnings in a new house, he simply thanked her curtly and moved on. If a new battle awaited, Dominic would meet it head-on, employing the same thoroughness that had delivered him justice the first time. The road ahead could prove equally tumultuous, but the man who had once been blindsided by abrupt accusations now stood on steadier ground, ready to defend his rights and his peace, no matter what Lucy Bowden had in store.